stop right there.
Ada? Who are you? And what are you doing here?
My faithful disciple will show her the path.
Ashley, run!
Resident Evil has been around for almost 3 decades. During that time, it completely changed survival horror, reinvented itself multiple times, and delivered some of the greatest games ever made. But it also gave us some of the franchise's biggest disappointments. So for this ranking, we are looking at both sides of the Resident Evil, the 5 weakest in tiers, and later the 5 greatest games the series has ever produced. This ranking is based on a combination of critic reviews, user scores, and the overall opinion of the Resident Evil community over the years. And don't worry, there are no story spoilers in this video. Let's start with the games Capcom would probably rather forget. Number 5. Resident Evil Survivor. Resident Evil Survivor wasn't a terrible idea. A first-person Resident Evil game actually sounded pretty interesting, especially back in 2000. Unfortunately, the execution never lived up to the concept. The gunplay feels awkward, the enemy encounters become repetitive very quickly, and compared to the mainline games, the atmosphere just isn't as memorable. Personally, I don't think Survivor is completely unplayable. It's simply forgettable. And that's almost worse for a franchise built on unforgettable moments. Number 4. Resident Evil Dead Aim. Dead Aim tried something different. Instead of fully committing to classic survival horror or full action, it landed somewhere in between. The result is a game that constantly feels like it's struggling to decide what it wants to be. Some mechanics are genuinely interesting, especially for the PlayStation 2 era, but inconsistent pacing and clunky combat hold it back. It's one of those games that hardcore fans may appreciate out of curiosity, but very few people would recommend as an essential Resident Evil experience.
Gosh, I got shot! Shot! Shot!
Number 3. Resident Evil 6. Now, here's the controversial one. Resident Evil 6 wasn't a bad game because it lacked content. In fact, it may have had too much. Multiple campaigns, huge amounts of action, constant explosions. The problem was that it barely felt like Resident Evil anymore. The horror took a backseat while the series leaned heavily into blockbuster action. To be fair, the co-op can still be fun with a friend. But when most fans think about Resident Evil, this usually isn't the experience they're looking for. Number 2. Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. On paper, this sounded amazing. A squad-based shooter set during one of Resident Evil's most iconic events. Sign me up. But reality was disappointing. The shooting lacked impact, the AI could be frustrating, the controls weren't as polished as they needed to be. And despite using one of the franchise's most beloved settings, it never captured the magic fans expected. Personally, I still think the idea deserved another chance. The execution simply wasn't there. Number 1. Umbrella Corps. If there's one Resident Evil game that almost everyone agrees on it, it's this one. Umbrella Corps took the franchise in a direction almost nobody wanted. Instead of focusing on atmosphere, explorations, or survival, it became a multiplayer shooter that struggled to stand out in an already crowded genre. The maps felt uninspired, the gameplay lacked depth, and the Resident Evil identity was almost impossible to recognize. To this day, it's still considered one of the weakest releases in the franchise's history. Not because Capcom tried something new, but because that experiment simply didn't work. But thankfully, Resident Evil isn't remembered for its failure. It's remembered for the games that reidentified horror. And that's where things get much more interesting. Coming up, the 5 greatest Resident Evil games ever made. Number 5. Resident Evil Code Veronica. Kicking off the top 5 is Resident Evil Code Veronica. Despite not carrying a number title, many fans have always considered it a true sequel to Resident Evil 2. It expanded the series in ways that felt ambitious at the time. The environments were larger, the presentation became more cinematic, and the story pushed the franchise into new territory without abandoning its survival horror roots. Of course, the game hasn't aged perfectly. Some mechanics can feel a little dated by today's standard, and the difficulty can occasionally be unforgiving. But that's part of its identity. Personally, I think Code Veronica deserves far more recognition than it usually gets. It may not be the first Resident Evil people recommend, but it's absolutely one of the most important. Before we continue, there's one game that's simply too new to rank fairly. Resident Evil Requiem has already made a strong first impression. It looks fantastic, introduced new ideas, and has generated plenty of excitement among fans. But great first impressions aren't enough. Some Resident Evil games became more appreciated over time. Others lost momentum after release. That's why I think Resident Evil Requiem deserves an honorable mention rather than a permanent spot in the list. Maybe in a few years, it will earn its place among the very best. Number 4. Resident Evil 2002 Remake. If there's one remake that almost every developer should study, it's this one. Resident Evil Remake didn't simply update the graphics, it respected everything that made the original special while improving almost every aspect of the experience. The atmosphere became darker, the mansion felt more believable, every hallway created tension. Every door made you wonder that waited on the other side. Even today, more than 20 years later, it still looks surprisingly beautiful. In my opinion, this isn't just one of the greatest Resident Evil games ever made. It's one of the greatest remakes in gaming history. Number 3. Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 took everything the first game established and made it better, bigger, more memorable. The two-character structure gave players different perspectives without making the experience feel repetitive. Raccoon City became one of gaming's most iconic locations, and the balance between exploration, horror, and resource management was almost perfect. There's a reason this game is still talked about decades later. It wasn't simply successful, it helped define what survival horror could be. This is probably the hardest game to leave outside the top 5. Resident Evil 7 did something incredibly important. It saved the franchise. After years of moving further toward action, Resident Evil finally turned to horror. The first-person perspective was a huge risk. Thankfully, it paid off. The atmosphere was terrifying, the pacing was excellent, and it reminded everyone why Resident Evil became famous in the first place. If your personal top 5 includes Resident Evil 7, I completely understand.
What the fuck?
Number 2. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Some villains became popular, others became legendary. Nemesis belongs in the second category. Every time he appeared, the tension immediately changed. You never felt completely safe. Resident Evil 3 also introduced faster pacing without losing the survival horror identity that defined the earlier games. It encouraged players to think quickly, while still making every bullet count. Personally, I think Nemesis is one of the greatest enemies Capcom has ever created, and that alone makes Resident Evil 3 unforgettable. Number 1. Resident Evil 4. Was there ever any doubt? Resident Evil 4 didn't just change Resident Evil, it changed the entire industry. Its over-the-shoulder camera influenced countless third-person shooters for years. The pacing was exceptional, the combat felt satisfying, the level design constantly introduced new ideas without becoming repetitive even today. It's incredibly easy to pick and enjoy. Very few games manage to reinvent themselves without losing their identity. Resident Evil 4 accomplished exactly that. And for many players, it still represents the absolute peak of the franchise. And that's it. Resident Evil has experienced incredibly highs and some for unforgettable lows. But maybe that's exactly why the series has survived for many long. It has never been afraid to experiment. Sometimes those experiments created masterpieces, sometimes they created disasters. But they always kept the franchise evolving. Now it's your time. Which Resident Evil games deserve their number 1 spot, and which one should have never been made? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this ranking, don't forget to subscribe and more videos. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos covering the best and worst games across gaming's biggest franchises.